So, this past June, India Walton made recent history, at least, by becoming the first self-identifying socialist to win the mayor's race for a major American city in over 50 years. However, after a brief victory lap, the story does not end there. After defeating a four-term incumbent, he launched a write-in campaign after losing the ability to get on the ballot. So the race continues. I'm so glad to be joined today by India Walton to talk about what's going on in Buffalo, New York. Welcome.
Thank you for having me, Briahna. I'm excited to be here.
Okay, so first and foremost, the $64,000 question is, how did you do it? Because a lot of the left feels kind of scarred and humbled by the way the establishment rallied against Senator Nina Turner and her race in Ohio's 11th district. And of course, the whole entire left is still smarting from the end of the 2020 campaign. Maybe that's projection. Maybe that's just me. Regardless, what insights do you have from being so successful in Buffalo?
We organized. We really had a very strong ground game. And I think that we were fortunate to be able to capitalize a lot of the energy that was sort of just left waiting for something to do, some actions to take part of as a result of the uprisings after the murder of George Floyd. So we were really able to turn that protest power into political capital, and that was critical to our win.
I've heard you in a recent interview reference the protest and the potential, political potential of that moment. And, you know, it seemed as though you thought more could be done more generally with the energy there last summer. Am I right to have gleaned that, read between the lines of your statement in a recent interview?
Yeah, I think a lot of our frustration here in Buffalo came from the fact that our electeds didn't feel that the protesters had enough political capital to move them. And I think that this challenge was proof that we actually do have political capital. And that's why it's been so surreal and astonishing, because this is a person who, after 16 years and 4 terms, a lot of people thought was unbeatable.
How does that translate? And I don't mean to derail this so early, but, you know, I've spoken a lot on this podcast about how frustrating it was to see all of the millions of people in the street and to, you know, read the newspaper banner saying this is the largest number of people mobilized in protest in American history. And at the same time, here in the context of a general election campaign, the Democratic candidate be so unmoved policy-wise by the demands that were being made in the street. And I wonder what why you think that was, and how an outcome could have been different, how that potential energy in the street could have been leveraged differently on a national scale.
I think the short answer is because we don't vote. Tweets are not votes. Even protests are not votes. And people who are in the political world and who are policymakers are reliant upon an electorate for their jobs. And if they feel like no matter what we're saying, no matter how smart it is, no matter how great a policy solution, if their office is not at risk because of that, then they're not going to be moved. So we got to vote. And it sounds so cliche, but that's who gets the attention in this country and in our counties and in our cities is voters. That's who gets the attention. Those are the squeaky wheels, and we have to wield that power at the ballot box in order to get the attention that we need and deserve.
The millions of people in the street last summer, it feels to me like a part of the issue is that not just that some people don't vote, that younger voters disproportionately aren't turning out as much, et cetera, but that they do vote, but they vote reliably for the Democratic candidate regardless. So Joe Biden doesn't actually have to, or, you know, whoever it is, doesn't actually have to listen to the concerns, because there is no credible threat to vote for an alternative party, an alternative candidate, or to withhold one's vote in lieu of concessions.
I agree with you on that. And, you know, this race here in Buffalo is a perfect example of that whole vote blue no matter who, right? Like, I do have the support of our local Democratic committee now, but I wasn't the endorsed candidate And established Democrats are reluctant to throw their support behind me, despite the fact that I'm the Democratic nominee, right? So then we get into conversations about neoliberalism and the plutocracy versus the working class, and people who actually want change. And if the Democratic Party is the mechanism by which we can accomplish those things, and I think that I'll speak for myself. Like, I'm not necessarily prepared to have that conversation right now because I don't know of any alternative that is going to really get the job done in a as quickly as we need it, right? The world is on fire. People are dying. We're not protecting women's rights. We're not protecting workers. So I just don't know where we go from here. But I think that having examples like this campaign and others that are happening all across Western New York and upstate are examples of really using alternative mechanisms and creating infrastructure so that we can challenge the status quo, move the party further left, and work something out in between.
Well, does the pushback against you right now after you won your primary cause you some skepticism about the ability for the left to use electoralism to make the kind of inroads that are necessary? And it's not just you, of course. It's what happened to Senator Nina Turner. It's what's happening right now to Shama Sawant in Seattle. I mean, we'll see. I mean, hopefully, inshallah, all goes well and you end up, mayor in the fall. But I mean, I don't know. There is definitely a cohort of the left that sees the willingness of the establishment Democrats to rise up against genuinely progressive candidates and says, well, there has to be another way. This isn't the way. Even though we might get a victory here and there has to be an alternative mechanism to kind of shift us into the level of change that we need, given the enormity of the crises that are before us, not just because of COVID, but the environment and other longstanding issues.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we have to build campaign structures of our own. We can't depend on the establishment to get our candidates elected. We have to go out and knock on our own doors, raise our own money, and really figure out the formula. And I think that what has worked in the past for corporate Democrats is not the feel, at least here in Buffalo and in New York State, that the voters are looking for. Folks are looking for people who are authentic, who are transformative leaders, who are engaged with them. And I think that is the new model that we're seeing catch on. And I hope that we are able to work all over the country to be able to elect more truly progressive candidates and really send a message to the Democratic establishment that we're here and we're not going anywhere anytime soon.
Well, India, let's talk about how you did, in fact, win. So I was looking a little bit at the numbers. You beat Byron Brown 11,637 to 10,627. Much like in the Ohio 11th race, the absentee ballots went overwhelmingly 2-1 to Byron Brown. But unlike in Ohio 11th, there weren't enough to actually close the gap. So you were successful there. Can you tell us a little bit about the demographic breakdown of who it was that came out to vote? Because there's a lot of discourse about how younger voters don't turn out. Was it younger voters turning out that put you over the edge? Do you have a sense of the breakdown along kind of ethnic and class lines?
Mm-hmm. So I performed best among college-educated, middle-class white millennials and renters. And that is very telling, especially because Buffalo has a poverty rate of about 30%. We're the third poorest city of its size in the country. And a lot of those folks are people of color. And I think it's a testament to what I'm truly up against is a 16-year heavily entrenched Democrat, Buffalo's first Black mayor, and a lot of the hopes and dreams of the Black community are still resting in the hope that because you have a Black person in office, that the material conditions of the community are going to change, and they have not. So what I need to overcome in this general election is sort of this notion that I am somehow the candidate of the white progressive left. And that my agenda is not necessarily an agenda that is going to play to the benefit of Black folks, because the words that I often use are working class and poor people. And a lot of people in the Black community don't identify with that and want to explicitly be named. Yeah, I don't know exactly where I'm going with this.
No. I mean, that's really interesting because so I watched the debate from earlier this month. Was it September 9th? And it was interesting to see the kinds of things they're hitting you with now. So, just to set a scene, you've got Byron Brown, who's back in there with his sleeves rolled up, taking a second bite at the apple, who very much is making an explicit appeal to homeowners. At one point, and maybe, Ben, we can play this clip, he tries to get you on the idea that you're going to raise taxes. And you have proposed a modest 3% increase in taxes because there are funding issues. Social services need to be funded, et cetera. And these tax cuts are coming from cuts to social services that are well needed. He says, well, if you're a homeowner and if you have a 3% tax on a $100,000 home, that's a whopping $300 a year.
I'm glad Ms. Walton admitted honestly that she's going to raise taxes on residents of the city of Buffalo. In fact, she said in an interview that she's going to raise taxes by 3%. 3% is not a modest tax increase. If you own a $100,000 home in the city of Buffalo, that means an extra $300 a year.
And I'm waiting for the punchline because he's comparing $300 a year raising taxes to who maybe you can put into context the kind of social services that are being underfunded in the state, in the city, which you point out is one of the poorest cities of its size in the nation.
Yeah, the interesting thing about that was it's an incremental tax increase. That's like 0.5% a year. The state law actually prohibits you from raising taxes 3% at one time, first of all. And also his math was off.
Look, zeros are hard.
Yeah. And, when I'm on doors talking to people who are homeowners, people are more than willing to pay a little bit extra to make sure that we're funding municipal services, to make sure that snow gets plowed on time, that trash is picked up, that we have adequate senior and youth services in our community. People are overwhelmingly more willing to pay taxes. And I think also folks want their leader to be honest about the tax and fee structure, right? So the mayor brags about not raising taxes, but we just had reassessments done on homes for the first time in 10 years. So guess what? People's tax bills went up. There's all kinds of fines and fees that are newly established on a regular basis in the city of Buffalo to make up for these huge deficits in revenue and budget gaps. So I keep telling folks, a tax by any other name is still a tax. A fine, a fee, a ticket, over-ticketing that disproportionately impacts poor working class people and people of color is still a tax. It's just being placed, the burden is being placed on those that really can't afford to pay.
Yeah, and you brought that up at the debate. I thought that was a really excellent point. I mean, I really do think you are more able to parry the kinds of attacks that the left gets constantly and should be well versed in at this point than a lot of politicians I've seen. So kudos to you. I don't recall hearing, though, this narrative that somehow you were like the white millennial left candidate, at least in the context of that debate. Is that something that you've seen come out in flyers or advertising that's been promulgated since your primary victory in quotation marks, whatever they're calling it?
Yeah, these are conversations from the ground. These are, the aunties at the barbecue who are concerned that I'm pushing someone else's agenda. But when I have an opportunity to speak to them, I'm like, absolutely not. Poverty reduction and making sure that government serves its people to the best of its ability is definitely not pushing someone else's agenda. We have just been sold this myth of hyper capitalism and rugged individualism, believing that if we pull ourselves up by our bootstraps and work hard enough, eventually we will get to a place of wealth and prosperity, ignoring the fact that there are systems that have been set up to prevent a large segment of our population from being able to do that.
Yeah, what's so interesting about this debate is that, even if it's true that some of these left candidates do disproportionately or are kind of put over the edge by this kind of white, middle class, younger millennial cohort, the same was true of AOC in the 14th district in New York, for example. The implication is that the moderate candidate is being put over by some more authentic Black working class cohort. And when you see the two of you on stage, what it feels like is that there is a bid for the people who actually vote at the end of the day, like it or not, which is, is it going to be the affluent older whites that put you over the edge, or the less affluent millennial whites that put you over the edge? And the idea that somehow anybody up there lays claim in terms of like pure electoral power to this working class base that we all know struggles to turn out for myriad reasons, myriad substantive and legitimate reasons that we should be working to reform. It's all kind of a silly sleight of hand.
Yeah, I think so. But I think that to my advantage is I am a working class person, right? I still am. And because people see me in the community doing regular things, I don't have the privilege of having someone else grocery shop or return my library books. I think that is something that is uniquely authentic about me. And I think that people are drawn to a leader that they feel is accessible. And that's what's been missing in the current administration. Is like, dude is like in his ivory tower over there somewhere making decisions on behalf of everyone else without ever even engaging or asking the people who are impacted by his decisions what they think about it. And I think people are looking forward to someone who actually cares about how they feel about where they live.
Well, I want to ask you a little bit about your background and what motivated you to get into politics and what motivated you to start to identify as a socialist. But I do want to drill down on the how of the winning before we move on. Because, certain things get thrown out when we talk about left victories. You have to organize, you have to knock doors, et cetera. But we've also seen lots of instances where people did those things, and whether it was because of negative advertising, the use of super PACs, whatever, they were unsuccessful. And it does feel like, at least in, the case of AOC's first run, that it was a little bit of Joe Crowley falling asleep at the wheel and not realizing that he had to actually run. And I have read that that's a similar instance in your case in Buffalo. It seemed as though when I took a quick look at Ballotopedia, that if about 20-ish thousand people came out to vote this time around, in 2017, the total turnout was almost twice as high, or a little more than twice as high. What combination of kind of turnout or the candidates falling asleep at the wheel do you think really contributed to your win? And what does that say about a subsequent round or other people, other leftists who are trying to do the same thing, who might not have the same benefit of a kind of hubristic candidate that they're running against?
They're calling this the Rose Garden strategy of my opponent, right? We felt from the beginning that because he ignored us in protests, that he was going to ignore a primary challenge. And that's what he did. He pretended like it didn't exist. He wasn't asleep at the wheel. He wasn't even in the car. He didn't do anything. He refused to debate. He refused to acknowledge that there was even a challenge. And because of that, his people stayed home and my people turned out. And that is a big reason why we were able to pull off the victory. So I think for us, it's a combination of deep organizing and relational organizing coupled with the traditional strategies that it takes to win campaigns that I think many progressive candidates don't quite get to because of challenges in fundraising, right? So along with deep canvases and knocking doors and phone banking, we didn't ignore the fact that some people's only contact with me was going to be through a mail piece or through a commercial. So we made sure that we still very aggressively fundraise to be able to pay for those paid media opportunities while using a grassroots strategy, and a combination of two coupled with the mayors ignoring our sheer existence was what ultimately was able allowed us to be victorious during the primary.
Am I right to have that I read that he out fundraised you 2-1? Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
And yet still he was so asleep at the wheel that he just didn't use that money to counter any of the advertising and flyering that you were doing?
He didn't. I think that we went up on TV first during the primary, if I'm not mistaken. And I think that we also had mail out before he did. And I think that after that happened, he was like, oh, crap, I better do something. But by that time, it was too late.
How concerned, if at all, are you about the general with Byron's participation? There's also this fellow Carlisle, who's a white attorney who is kind of pitching himself as partyless. He used to be a Democrat, he says, but he's fed up with Democrats and he won't commit to being a Republican. And he has this kind of Pete Buttigieg energy that he's bringing to this, trying to occupy middle ground. And then there's a Republican candidate, a black guy, I'm sorry, I'm blocking his name.
Jazz Miles,
who is a fast food franchise owner, who kind of did the Black Republican pitch. You know, Lincoln was a Republican sort of deal. Doesn't seem to be considered a threat by anyone. Byron got a few rather amusing digs at him in the debate. Are you concerned about what's going to happen either with the write-in campaign or these other candidates?
I am concerned about Brown's write-in campaign because there's lots of money and resources behind it, right? Like all three of these people are basically Republicans. Brown is getting GOP money. There are Republican independent expenditures. His talking points, if you close your eyes, you don't know whether you're hearing from a Democrat or a Republican. Mm-hmm. So it is of concern because he has enough resources, he has enough name recognition that a long shot like a write-in campaign in a mayoral election of a mid-sized city, it makes it into a real possibility. We know he's going to outspend. We know he's going to out fundraise. He takes money from corporations and developers, and we do not. So we're taking it very, very seriously. You know, as for Ben Carlisle, who doesn't belong to a party, but was at an anti-vax and anti-mask rally a couple of days ago, we know what that means behind the coded language. But these are folks who have failed to mount any serious type of campaign, and I doubt that they're going to account for any significant percentage of the electorate. This race is really being run between myself, the only candidate that's on the ballot, and Byron Brown, who you do know that for a short time he was placed back on the ballot under a line that he invented by a Trump-appointed judge. Right.
So the lower court said he could go ahead and he formed this new party. What was it called?
The Buffalo Party.
The Buffalo Party. I remember reading that and thinking we should make up like parody T-shirts. The Buffalo Party, but then recently a higher court overturned that decision, correct?
Mm-hmm.
All right. So you're the only person on the ballot. That has to be, that's incredibly significant. I'm curious though, because I was also reading that the term socialism, the issue of socialism wasn't really coming up as much, largely, I guess, because Brown was just ignoring your campaign in the first round. In a recent article, a local voter said, you know, I don't see this as much as an absolute victory of democratic socialist policies versus the establishment. I'll tell you, I got 6 mailers from India Walton. None of them mentioned her as a democratic socialist. Is it going to be different this time around now that you have demonstrated your status as a credible threat to the status quo?
I don't think it's going to be different. I think that we have a responsibility to fully explain what socialism means, what it is and is not. And, you know, when folks ask about my decision to run as a DSA candidate, if I'm running as a Democrat and if the experience under Democratic leadership has been one that we still don't have equity, we still don't have justice, what differentiates me from every other Democrat, right? The city of Buffalo has been under Democratic control since I've been alive. 65% of registered voters are Democrats, but we still have some of the highest poverty rates in the country, right? So what is going to make India Walton different? So being a democratic socialist allows me to be forward about wanting healthcare for all, wanting affordable housing for all, wanting a quality education for our children, fighting for labor rights and collective bargaining rights. So for me, I think that it was advantageous not only to be able to name the things pretty neatly that we all want as working class folks, but also to be able to get out of the box of being a corporate Democrat and also garnering national attention so that we will be able to be competitive in fundraising and getting our message out to voters.
Well, maybe this is a good moment for you to tell our audience a little bit about your background, your personal story, and what led you to your politics.
Sure. So I'm from Buffalo. I grew up here on the East Side, and 85% of the East Side is people of color. And it's an area where there are lots of pockets of concentrated poverty and disadvantage. I went to Buffalo Public Schools. I gave birth to my first child at 14 years old. By the time I was 19, I had 3 children. I gave birth to twins who were extremely premature. And because of my experience, 6 months in the hospital with my babies, I wanted to do something more. I complained to one of the nurses about not feeling like I had any say over the care my children received. And she said, if you don't like it, you should go be a nurse. So I went and became a nurse. And I went and I worked in that same NICU. And on the inside, it was even worse than it was from the outside. Now I knew for sure that babies, innocent infants, receive different treatments depending on what insurance their parents carried, if any at all. So eventually I went on to become a school nurse, and it didn't get any better in that setting either, because I was interacting with children who were coming to the nurse's office asking if I had any extra breakfast bars for them to take home because they didn't have food, or children who were chronically late or absent because they were the primary caregiver while their parents were at work working nights and they didn't get home until morning time, so they were always late to school. And just the living with the trauma of community violence and familial violence, and having kids just come to me just wanting love and care. And I'm like, I have to do something more. So that led me to organizing, which eventually led to a position as executive director of an affordable housing agency. And as an advocate and a nonprofit director, going to the city, asking for help implementing policy, building affordable housing, and having that be the barrier, I thought I must do something. And then, like I said, after the summer, after the non-response to the uprisings, after the dismal pandemic response, I said, I'm going to do it. If anyone can challenge him and have any chance of winning, it's me. I'm untethered to the system. He can't stop my money. I'm a registered nurse. I can always work as a nurse. I can't be blacklisted in the city of Buffalo. Well, I don't think I can. Well, that remains to be seen. But, you know, I had built up enough of a base over the last few years, and I knew some really smart people that didn't necessarily have political acumen, but had the organizing skills to help us really mount a serious campaign. And then enter Working Families Party DSA and all of the other national endorsements allowed us to come out victorious. So I'm super proud of the work that we've done already. And I'm confident that we're going to be able to win in November as well.
I want to follow up on the point about infants in the NICU getting different treatment based on the kind of insurance their parents have. Because I remember during the campaign, there was a lot of discourse about the maternal mortality rate, and rightly so, but very little discourse about the kinds of factors that drive it outside of discrimination from doctors, right? So, I heard nurses talking about discharging patients who were very home insecure, and how every time they would come in for a wellness check, there'd be a different address on the forms, and people living in all kinds of conditions that are obviously not suitable for vulnerable infants. But this insurance piece, I think, is incredible to people who haven't had a direct experience with the system or blessedly live in a country that has universal health care. So can you talk a little bit more about what you witnessed as a nurse that really motivated your politics?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, it can go, everywhere from whether a child is going to get a 3-day course of IV antibiotics or have to have a 10-day course of oral antibiotics, right? When children go home, it means the difference between whether they get a week's worth of supplies at a time that they have to stretch over 30 days or 30 days of supplies that they get to, have enough supplies for each day. It really is disheartening. It's unethical, and it's disappointing the way healthcare has been commodified. And it's a stark contrast between the haves and the have-nots. And when we talk about social determinants of health, and a lot of times, we're labeling people as non-compliant with their treatment plans when they don't have the tools that they need to be compliant, right? If a person has high blood pressure and we're telling them to eat a healthy diet and exercise, but they don't have access to fresh food in their neighborhood or an outdoor space where they can go walk around and feel safe, then we have not addressed the health of the whole person. And this is what we see time and time and time again. But when you are in these institutions of healthcare and learning, you don't see that because you have not engaged in the community where you're serving the people. You spend your time inside that building and you have no idea what people are facing on the ground and in their homes. I was 19 years old. I brought my very vulnerable children home on oxygen with a central line, and I was catching the bus. I took them to follow-up appointments, 2 babies, 1 under each arm, with monitors on my back and oxygen tanks on my back, and we got on the bus. And that's not the healthiest situation for mothers who are in these types of predicaments. And then we wonder why the health outcomes are so poor, and it's because we have not resourced people appropriately.
Yeah. The thing I think that is so radicalizing about healthcare as an issue and why it became the central plank of not just the Bernie campaign, but kind of left activism, is because I do think most people, at least once you get to, 35, 40, are going to have had some direct experience with the healthcare system. And it's always demoralizing. And the ethics of it are so obviously dismal. And it's, I think, an easy access point for people to start to think of various social programs as a human right, because it does seem essential in a way that perhaps some other things like, student debt cancellation or whatever feel a little less attenuated from a little more attenuated rather from a literal life and death issue. And, I'm curious what you see as the future of not just healthcare advocacy, but of this kind of Bernie-style movement where feels like the country is starting to move toward a greater understanding that housing should be a human right, that all of these things should be a human right. At the same time that we're seeing so much pushback over the basic simple needs in these infrastructure bills, for instance, which were ostensibly supposed to be voted on this week and got pushed earlier this week and got pushed. You know, I know that you're focused on local politics, but as someone who has said in the past that you were in part radicalized by Bernie coming onto the stage in 2016 and seeing a different way, I'm curious what you make of the state of left politics more broadly and what you see as a credible path forward so that the kind of radicalizing experiences that you've had, the first person experiences that so many millions of Americans have had with our healthcare system, et cetera, find a political voice somewhere that can lead to substantive change and not this draining trudge of incrementalism that I think have caused so many folks to sit out of elections and to give up.
Mm-hmm. I think a big part of it is allowing folks the space to grow. I think a lot of the problem of progressivism is that we are not very inclusive if folks are not woke enough.
Say more about that, because I've heard you say that in another interview, that there's a little bit of purity politics that's the problem.
There's a lot of bit of purity politics that's the problem, right? I think that as a movement, we have to come to an understanding about what the fundamental basics are, but then provide like a little bit of flexibility and nimbleness and allow people to get there because it takes time. And we don't want to lose people in the process. I said this morning, there are not too many people, no matter how old you are, that I can't convince that healthcare is a human right. Mm-hmm. But when I go to a senior center and we're going to talk about the New York Health Act, mm-hmm. and I say, my name is India, I go by she, her, mm-hmm. and I'm here to talk to you about universal health care, we're going to spend more time talking about why I introduced myself as she, her than we are about the reason why I got there. And mm-hmm. I can't outright dismiss those people because they've never heard of it, mm-hmm. right? What I'm going to probably do is put that in the parking lot and we'll come back to it, but talk about the reason why we're here today. And that's kind of maybe too simple of an example, but we just have to expand the tent, allow more people in, because that's how we learn. And I think a lot of times we expect people to come to us already prepared with everything that they're ever going to need to be this progressive beacon of hope. And it's just not true. We all have a lot of learning to do throughout this process. But, back to your original question, we're ready for it. There have been so many stories about people who have been mistreated by our healthcare system, untreated by our healthcare system, gone bankrupt because of the need to care for a loved one or themselves who is facing some type of chronic illness. And if there is any gift that we received from COVID-19, it is that socialized medicine is possible and it is good for our society when you don't have to worry about paying to get immunized, when you don't have to worry about paying for testing, when you're not worried about paying for treatment. There are people who delay treating illnesses because they cannot pay. People who walk around literally dying every day for lack of enough money to pay to keep themselves healthy. And when we expand that conversation, right, we're talking about the expansion of infrastructure into human infrastructure, including childcare and feminized labor. Let's expand the conversation about what healthcare is. Housing is healthcare. Food is healthcare. Taking care of our environment, climate justice is healthcare. Clean air and water is healthcare. All of those things are healthcare. And until we begin to address all of these, we are not going to create a healthy society.
Yeah, I mean, you're singing my song. I think what's frustrating to a lot of progressives is that despite having come off of what felt like a leftward swing in a movement, not just a campaign, in this moment, instead of creating the kind of public pressure on the intransigent cinemas and mansions of the world by continuing to connect people's personal experiences to these policies and talking about how, housing is healthcare and all of these things, there's almost no discussion of the substantive policy that's in something like the human infrastructure bill. It's all about a $3.5 trillion number. And so if you can then have an abstract conversation about lowering the number while sidestepping the substantive conversation about whose benefits to what vulnerable group are getting cut or aren't being provided as a consequence of deciding that you just don't like how 3.5 looks and you want it to be 2.5, or especially given that this is a 3.5 that's coming down from 6. And I think some of the lack of confidence in elected officials, even progressive elected officials, comes from what feels like less rhetorical weight behind those kinds of issues, less substantive rhetorical conversation about the stakes here. And that's not to say, I mean, they seem to be holding the line right now with respect to these bills, so we'll see what happens, and they deserve a lot of plaudits for that. But it does feel like that part of the conversation was really growing in central over the last 5 years or so, and all conversation about Medicare for all is kind of poof off the table. You brought up the New York Health Act. Where does that stand right now? The idea of a state Medicare for all system in New York.
Yeah, I think that going into our second cycle of a Democratic majority and with more progressives in our state legislature and with upstate mayors who are going to be working with their state reps to really push it, I think 2022 might be the year. I'm hopeful that we'll see the passage, and I think that similar to marijuana legalization, we'll start to see states go and hopefully have it be a brighter conversation on the federal level.
Well, what are kind of the local barriers to it right now?
Locally, I don't think there are very many barriers. I think that, we have to think about which insurance companies are lobbying which electeds, be honest about that, get real about it, and just prioritize the health of our people.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly what I mean, kind of the political barriers to passing the New York Health Act. I mean, are there, particular officials who are obstructing? Is there, for years, for example, up until 2018, even though New York's a Democratic state, you had this IDC, this caucus of Democrats that would caucus with the Republicans and basically obstruct anything good that could possibly come down the pike. I mean, are there any kind of those structural barriers that we should be keeping an eye out for as we watch the progress of the New York Health Act?
I'd be interested to see how the vote goes. I think that, excuses are far gone now. With the elimination of the IDC, with Governor Hochul at the helm now, I think that the time for excuses is long gone. So I look forward to seeing the passage of the New York Health Act this next cycle.
Well, the last thing I wanted to ask you about was how you deal with the attacks that come your way over Defund the Police. That was a real central theme when I watched the debate, and I thought you handled those questions really well. Ben, do we have the defund clip to play real quick?
Ms. Walton, we hear defund the police, reallocate the police budget. This is all police reform, but how do you do it? What stays, what goes, and will there be enough money for police training based on how you want to reallocate funding for police?
Thank you for your question. The fact of the matter is I haven't campaigned on defund the police.
There's one person up here that's been defunding our community that's caused crime to run rampant over the last 5 years. We've been defunding community centers. Our pools were closed this summer. We've been defunding senior and youth services. My plan is to free police to do police work, which is solving crime, investigating crime, and keeping our community safe.
But how specifically do you plan to do that? How do you plan to spread out the money? How do you plan to reallocate the budget to meet your objectives?
The first thing we do is we stop police from being dog catchers, homelessness outreach, mental health counselors, and we put professionals into those roles that is their job to do. We cut police overtime. We can end the militarization. We don't need tanks on the streets when people peacefully protest. There are lots of ways. And under a Walton administration, we're going to have a transparent budget process so that we'll be able to tackle those issues head on.
I thought you did a really good job of reframing the issue of defund in a way that I haven't seen a lot of folks on the national stage do. I mean, what's your observation been about how Democrats as a whole have handled the defund issue, including, but not limited to, how Joe Biden handled it last summer in the midst of all these protests?
Yeah, I think that we have to just change the language, make it understandable for people, because using one word to describe an entire policy platform it just doesn't work for people. And when you hear the word defund, it sounds like, oh, so you're just going to get rid of the police. And even among true progressives who are a part of the abolition movement, it's just like we have to start somewhere, right? We do a lot of focusing on dismantling systems of oppression without having built something to replace it. So we have to do both. And I think that our campaign really focuses on the details of the plan and the intersectionality of what it means to live in a safe community, not only addressing police in their budgetary needs, but also the job that we're expecting them to do, the culture that is set forth by police, as well as addressing the root causes of community violence and crime.
Well, Eric Adams, of course, recently won the Democratic primary to be mayor of New York City, in a move that kind of, I think, shocked some pundits that didn't expect conversations about the need to address, violent crime in lower income, predominantly Black and brown communities would be so resonant with that population, a population that's presumed to want to just vote for, maybe perhaps a Maya Wiley or a Dianne Morales type. What advice would you give to progressives to be able to compete against a Eric Adams type the next time that rising crime or what have you gets weaponized in this way in electoral context?
The key is listening to the people, right? Like, we can't come into communities with these prepackaged solutions. My role as an elected official is not to do just what I want, but to also listen to the concerns of the folks who live in neighborhoods. And there's not a one size fits all solution to any of this. So I think that we have to have all parties at the table, particularly those who are most impacted by these things, and really listen to their concerns and work that into platform and policy.
Yeah, it does feel like sometimes the left wants to pretend that crime is a non-issue, that it's a complete fabrication because perhaps they live in communities where they don't have to deal with it directly every day. And I think there's some skepticism about the ability to address crime without feeding into kind of a ramping up of the prison system. But right. Thank you for the time that you spent here today. Can you let our audience know how they can support you and your campaign efforts or any other projects you might be working on right now?
Sure. They can visit www.indiawalton.com, follow us on social media, donate, sign up to volunteer. We take volunteers from all over the country. We're phone and text banking as well. So look forward to seeing everybody on November 2nd when we bring home this big win.
Thank you so much for taking the time with us today, and good luck. Hey, YouTube, don't forget this is a podcast. To get full episodes, including ones that are behind a paywall, go to patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. To get more episodes, please do subscribe to this channel, hit the notification bell, and like this video.